That's okay. Because this last half, this evening, I call my clerk theory. And years ago, when I discovered I would be making speeches, looked like from then on, it seemed like if I tried to use notes, I seemed glued to my notes, and if I didn't, I couldn't remember what I was going to say and in what order. So I developed a little system of acronyms, and I'd given this talk a number of times, and so I thought it through and decided that if I would arrange it in this order, it would spell CLERT, the acronyms. And you'll notice I put it in bold-faced type, so it spells C-L-U-R-T. Well, when the university started asking me to come over and give talks to classes over there, it was a little bit embarrassing when a professor would call me up and say, Paul, would you come over and give us your CLERT theory? And here was this meaningless word that he didn't know that there was no meaning attached to it other than the order. So, hi. So, there's 2 calls on your phone that you don't need to answer.
Sorry.
That's all right. See what he did? He gave me this, and so I didn't have to worry about it. Yeah, okay. Just a pair of shorts is all it takes. Now, what's different about this outline is that I indicate that I'm going to spend 1 hour on creating context, and I ended up spending 3. And that's okay, because I learned a little something last time, that when you give me the time that I think I need, I do want to spend more time explaining how very important it is to create context. So I'm going to do that before I give you my CLERT theory by doing this. I'm going to put something on the board here now, and I'm going to tell you, this little simple statement I'm going to put on the board will explain more human behavior than anything I've ever run across in one succinct statement. Now, this is, I'd like to, I think we did last time, but I'd like to reiterate that these principles apply in a very real way to home, your relationship with your kids or your husband or your wife, whoever. Here's something that you might and everything I'm going to say for the rest of the afternoon falls as this is sort of an umbrella. Everybody seeks significance in their environment. Everybody seeks significance. I can create a fight any place, anytime, anywhere by simply putting you down. Now, when I say put you down, I mean it doesn't have to be an insult. It doesn't have to be a slurring name. It can be just simply diminishing your significance, for example, by ignoring you. One of the interesting things I noticed when I go to restaurants and I see somebody I know, and let's say they have a 5-year-old and a little baby, or maybe even a 3-year-old and a little baby, who gets the attention? Have you ever watched the older child while this is going on? He's over here on the side, and he's watching and all this going on. What do you suppose is going on in his head? Envy or disappointment? Or I'll tell you, years ago I decided every time I was aware of this, I would look for this kid and pay special attention to him, simply because I know that this little kid's being left out. It's no wonder we have sibling rivalry. Now, the same thing is true when you see a celebrity and his spouse. Here's a celebrity, and celebrities will tell you this. If their spouse is with them, people will come up, let's say you two, and I'm greeting you, and I'll go right past her to shake your hand and not give her a look. So there's all kinds of ways of diminishing people in their environment. I'll have to share this with you. My first stint, I was in the ministry for 12 years, from 1952 to 64. And when I resigned in 1964, it was absolutely amazing to me. I was in the same group of people, and suddenly people didn't know who I was because I dropped the title. It was just as though I didn't exist. It was incredible because all the credibility went to the title. And we do this, of course, with our president and things like that. People who don't like Clinton, there's some of them at least, who still give him credibility because he carries the title. Not everybody. I noticed that they booed him at the Olympics. And I thought that was kind of shoddy, you know, because I really give credibility to people who have won enough regard from the people to get elected. It seems to me like they can't be all bad. It surprised me a little bit when David Letterman asked Rush Limbaugh on his program one night if he could think of anything good to say about the Clintons. He couldn't come up with anything. Now I'm going to show you my bias. I decided that I was watching an ignorant man. Now, let's get back to, and that's making no statement about what I think or don't think about Bill and Hillary. That's just simply, when you can't think of anything good to say about something, you're not looking. We're so focused in on what we don't like, we simply can't entertain other thoughts. I was talking to some parents. I'd worked with their son many years ago, and he was not a mean kid, but he certainly was an ornery one. And they were kind of apologizing to me for what they considered to be the hard time he gave me years ago. And I said to them, hey, he was just a freedom-loving kid. He wasn't going to be bound by all the rules that society places on him. And I want to say something here. When kids break, or employees, I don't care who it is, when we break over the limits, let's be careful that we don't call that misbehavior, because have you noticed how institutions, if somebody breaks what they consider a rule, then the institution passes a rule for everybody? I remember years ago at Loveland High School, they passed a rule that the boys couldn't wear beards. So I went to the assistant principal, his name was Don, and I said, Don, let me understand something. The hair that grows naturally on this boy's face, there's something wrong with it? And he says, well, don't you believe in neatness? I says, yeah, so why don't you pass a rule about neatness? Why do you pass it about beards? Well, he says, how are you going to enforce that? I said, oh, I get it. You'd rather have a rule, a stupid rule you could enforce, than an intelligent rule that's tough to enforce, right? And then they passed a rule that girls couldn't wear blue jeans. Same school. I went there, same assistant principal, and I said, Don, I said, why? Now tell me, why is it that it's okay for a boy to wear blue jeans and it's not okay for a girl to wear blue jeans? Well, he says, don't you believe in femininity? I says, gee. I said, you mean a girl in blue jeans with a size too small jeans isn't feminine? Well, he says, how are we going to enforce that? He said, oh, I know what we can do. He says, no one can wear denim. I said, Don, there are people out there right now wearing denim, don't know they're wearing denim. He says, oh, come on, Paul. See, he was the one who thought that all denim came in blue jeans like that. Of course, we're beyond that now, aren't we? But what we do typically in these situations is we pass rules for everybody. And guess all of those who weren't guilty of this, how do they feel at that point? All the people who didn't do what this rule was meant for, how do they feel? They have to obey a rule that they never violated. Isn't that a put down? Think about it. So, everybody seeks significance, and if I want to quarrel, all I have to do is say to you, you mean you're this old and this is all further you got? I don't even know how far you've gotten. I can say that, and if I'm not someone who you have some regard for that I'm playing jokes with you, you're going to feel defensive, aren't you? You know what I think I told you this last time, I think kids become most irate, the most irate in my experience, is when adults treat them as though they were too dumb to learn the lesson the first and second and third time, and they have to be told again. The most angry responses I get from kids are for that. That's a put down. Now, let's get, with this in mind, considering the fact that everybody seeks significance in environment, I'd like to share with you now 5 principles of communication. These are principles that I did not learn from a book. I learned it from working with people. This is what people taught me. Many times they didn't know they were teaching me a lesson. In fact, most of my education came outside the classroom. The first principle that I learned is, let's replace the word, well, let's do it this way. Let's replace the word interest with, I'll put it this way, with curiosity. Now, I choose these particular words because it seems to me that we can be very interested in someone, in our kids, in our fellow workers or whatever it was, but you don't necessarily rule out being judgmental. But if you're curious about them, by definition, you rule out judgmentalness. Let me illustrate that. Let's go to your home situation, and then we can apply it to the work situation. Here's your son, comes in at 10 o'clock in the evening. You expected him at 8. And you meet him at the door with something like this: "Where have you been?" Now, let me ask you something. Are you interested? But what if you were just curious? See, you can be interested and you can be non-judgmental, but you can also be judgmental. Where have you been? By the way, just a little sidelight on that. Whenever we meet each other at the door, spouse, or when bosses meet their employees with this, "Where have you been?" what you get in response has almost nothing to do with the truth. Even though it may be couched in truthful expression, that's not the point of it. Isn't to convey truth to somebody else. The idea is to get that person off their back. Isn't that true? And by the way, there's no right answer to the question. If you say to your boss, "Well, I got caught in traffic and all of this," well, that isn't designed. The whole idea of it is to give the angry person a response that you think he'll buy. And so it's an exercise in not telling the truth. That's what it is. And communication cannot take place until we're telling the truth about things. Now, there are some wonderful things happen when we take the position of being curious. One of the things that I think everybody in here will recognize is that if anybody tells you what your motives are for doing something, probably every one of us get angry at that. You just did that. You just did that to create a stir around here. You just did that to get attention. You just did that. You know, all those imputing of motives to the other person create an angry, hurt, or resentful response, no matter what they are. But when we take a curious response, when we respond to somebody curiously, 2 very wonderful things happen. The first one is that I cannot be curious about you without giving you worth. The minute I turn, see, this is Carol here. The minute I look you in the eye and say, "Carol, what how did your day start this morning? Was this a good day? It doesn't make any difference what it's about. But if I honestly look at you and ask you and want to know, and I don't respond judgmentally what you tell me, I've automatically imparted worth to her from me to you. One of the things I get a lot from people who, I guess I'm slow to call myself a therapist, although I function in that capacity a lot. I think of myself more as an educator than a therapist. And sometimes I'm talking to somebody, and it may be at the end of the hour before I discover they've been to therapists or psychiatrists or somebody like that. And I will sometimes ask them, I said, well, how does what we've done here match up with what you learned from your psychologist or whoever it was? And sometimes they'll say, well, at least you listened to me. And I wondered what that meant. I don't know what went on. But the point of it is that if they recognize that I honestly listened to them, that made them feel good about it. It enhanced their sense of significance in the environment, that they were worth my time. So the first thing that happens here is we elevate self-esteem simply by honestly being curious about people and wondering what happened. I like to go into whether it's if I could come to your workplace and be curious about what you're doing and what you're happy. In fact, when I go into a business, let's set the stage like this. Let's say I go into a business and I ask for something, and maybe I'm talking to the manager, and he says to one of the other folks, he said, what Paul wants is back there on that shelf just on the left-hand side of the door. Why don't you go back and get, that. That leaves me standing there with the manager. So what I like to do is I like to look around and say, how did you get into a business like this? It is incredible what you learn from people when they tell you about that.
Evelyn Hubbard.
They will tell you things. I've been amazed at what people will tell me, and I'm a stranger to them just because I was curious. They start telling me all about their problems, and it wasn't particularly what I was interested in, but I started doing this, and it wasn't long until people began to call me and say, Paul, do you know where I would get such and so? And I would say, no, I don't know, but I know who knows. I said, if you'll call so-and-so at such and such a store, they can tell you. Now here, I didn't know. All I could do is tell them who does know, and they'd give me credit for it, and they'd say, I knew I should have called you first. As though I knew. But I didn't know. I just knew who knew. But it was quite interesting to me how those little simple questions that I asked around ended up making me knowledgeable, not about answers, but where to get answers. In fact, I've decided that I'm a career counselor. I never set out to be a career counselor, but people come, I think I average one every 2 weeks. I have for years. People come and they say, I know this isn't your business, but can you tell me where I might find a job? And what they do, I get them in touch with people who are doing the kind of things they're interested in. The only thing I can look back on and say what filled me in was simply being curious about people, wondering how they got into that business. See, we were living in Loveland when it was first announced that Hewlett-Packard was coming to